All right, hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's Founder is a bunch of founders. Welcome to Founder of the Day. This is our week in review. For those of you who are new here, what I do is I discuss the last 7 articles I've published on my website, founderoftheday.com, which are all about different American revolutionaries, unheralded stories of the revolution, yada, yada, yada. But if you are here, thank you for coming. Let me know how the sound is. I was messing around with it a lot yesterday, trying to prepare for some new interviews, and I hope I didn't mess anything up for these normal live videos, so let me know if there's any problems. If not, thank you so much for coming. Let's get right into it. Now, this week's a little bit different than most of the weekly review videos because last week I published my annual top 100 most influential American founders list. And, well, I made a whole video about that separately last Thursday. I am not going to go back into that right now. 100 was a lot to do once. I'm certainly not going to do it again. I also learned that doing an hour-long live video Wednesday, Thursday, Friday takes a lot out of me, and I can't be drinking coffee at that point. Thank you for giving me the heads up, Matthew. I am pleasantly surprised it sounds great because I had a lot of trouble practicing with my spouse the screen for interviews. It's going to be cool, but for some reason, just can't get the sound right. Either way, we'll figure that out. None of your concern. I will pop up here. I did do this last week. 100 American founders. Oh, what am I popping up here? Nope. Did I change it? Did I screw something up here? What's going on here? Well, whoopsie daisy. That's not what I meant to do. I'm not sure why that's happening. Well, okay. I guess we're going to look at my YouTube channels in the back for some odd reason. Well, you know what? I'm going to go back to the hosting. Well, I apologize for that. That's a not what I was looking for, and I'm not sure why it won't let me change it. Probably because running this through my computer slows things down a whole lot. Well, you know what? Just 1 second here. I should be able to fix that up real quick. So we'll pop that back up, and I do apologize for this little technical difficulty. We'll get right through it, but I want to put my screen up for you guys. I know you liked it. You like it to get to see it. Again, I'm not entirely sure why this is happening. What if we do that? Well, can we cover that up? Does that make a difference? No. Okay, we'll run without it this week. Oh, well, I guess it's just me this week. I literally just tested it before we went live. Oh, well, tissues and teardrops. Anyway, I went through 100 founders last week. Not going to go through it again. What we are going to do is one of the articles has some few extra founders. It's about a handful of brothers, so we'll make it up that way. And technically, we'll be discussing 8 people this week. So let's get on with it after that little technical difficulty, and I do apologize. But we are going to go with, starting on Friday, where we do our Anti-Federalist Fridays, we're going to talk about Mercy Otis Warren. Now, Mercy Otis Warren is famous as an author during the American Revolution, one of the not just preeminent female writers, but just one of the best writers of the American Revolution generation. She was an anti-federalist, despite the fact that many Massachusettsians, many people of Massachusetts, especially the area around Boston where she lived, were very wealthy and federalists. She was an anti-federalist, and the first thing you notice when you're reading her paper, which is called Observations on the New Constitution and on the Federal and State Conventions. The first thing you notice reading the observations, as I'll call them for short, is Mercy Otis has a very beautiful writing style, which you don't usually get in political writings then or now. You know, she's up there rivaling that of Thomas Jefferson with the language she uses. On a more important point, she discusses several reasons. I believe it was 18 specific reasons, and she actually outlines that there are more that she doesn't discuss when she's criticizing the Constitution of the United States. She writes under the title, A Columbian Patriot. Of course, many people use pseudonyms, and especially a woman had to use a pseudonym at that point, although notably in the future, Mercy Otis Warren would be the first woman to publish under her real name in the United States. She would also write a history of the American Revolution, one of the earliest. But speaking specifically to her observations on the Constitution, she outlines many things. Notably, she compares the close relationship between the legislature and the executive. Makes her very nervous. On top of that, the fact that the legislature can pay itself, and they can raise taxes, and there are no term limits. So she assumed that the legislature and the president would just work together indefinitely to keep getting themselves elected, to keep raising taxes, to keep accumulating money and power, and there was no Bill of Rights. So there was nothing the people would be able to do to stop it. And this would inevitably lead to an aristocracy. And we hear a lot of criticisms and accusations that aristocracy would come from the Constitution, from the Anti-Federalists. But the way Mercy Otis points it out, very specifically, is fairly unique to her. Again, she assumed that they would be, what she says that you don't hear a lot of is that she expected the president and the House and Senate to work very closely together to suppress the people, which is interesting. Again, as always, if you have any questions, let me know. For whatever reason, those of you joining us, not sure why, can't pull up my images in the back. It's showing us the wrong screen. I think I do know why. I switched them at the last second, which was a mistake. Trying new screens out with this new setup. Anywhoozle, let's continue. On Saturday, I published an old article, as I do on the weekends, regarding the Edward brothers. The Edward brothers fight tyranny together. And the Edward brothers are a family from just north of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They have a very interesting relationship. They are three brothers who all at some point served in the Pennsylvania militia, even though they were fairly wealthy. The first one, Marshall, he's the oldest brother. Hears about Lexington and Concord, and he jumps in, joins the Philadelphia militia as a captain, and eventually becomes a member of the flying camp. And flying camps were meant to essentially be like the Minutemen were in New England, but for the Continental Army and for individual states, there's move at a moment's notice. You hear about trouble, you get the flying camp out there, they get a head start, everyone else will follow. He ends up, eventually, Marshall Edwards becomes the paymaster of the Philadelphia soldiers. So he's a pretty important person. Unfortunately, Marshall passes away at just 31 years old in 1778. Now, I was unable to find exactly why he passed away. There's a gentleman named Samuel Jones, who was the executor of Marshall's estate and who was supposed to take care of his children, his now orphaned children. And this person said that Marshall, quote, dies, quote, in service of his country. And while you hear that and you think, okay, he probably died in battle, right? Well, not necessarily. If he died in battle, it would have probably been easier to find a reference to a battle that he died in, but I could not. Instead, it seems that dying in service of his country could also mean, and I'm speculating here, but it could also mean that he caught one of the many sicknesses that ran through the camp of every segment of every army at that point in world history, and may have died of disease in camp, but that would have included, that's why the vague in service of his country would have been referenced, as opposed to was shot or hit with the bayonet or other things that we do hear usually when someone dies in battle. Either way, died fighting for the Patriot cause. Fortunately, he had two other brothers to live on. Again, he was just 31 years old. He was the youngest age of the brothers. Most of these brothers would not live very long, unfortunately. But next we talk about Enoch Edwards, or we're going to talk about Enoch Edwards. Enoch Edwards was trained as a physician. He's actually one of the first people to study under Dr. Benjamin Rush. Dr. Benjamin Rush, of course, is famous as one of the physicians to sign the Declaration of Independence and was an early abolitionist, ahead of his time in a lot of things, mental health, things of that nature, behind the times in certain things for sure, but, one of the most forward-thinking doctors of the time, and Enoch Edwards studied under him in Pennsylvania, becoming a physician of his own, but then almost immediately joining, again, the Pennsylvania militia, like his older brother. Enoch, interestingly, on July 4th, 1776, which is, the day the Declaration of Independence was adopted, several Continental congressmen wanted to celebrate, and many of those, including Thomas Jefferson himself, went to the house of Enoch Edwards for a celebratory dinner. And this wasn't like the house in the city. This was his vacation home or country estate, I guess you could call it, just outside the city. I mean, it's not like he had to travel too far, but that's where they went to celebrate independence. So I found that particularly interesting. And I also, again, I published this article a while ago, and I'm reading through it, and I'm like, each one of these brothers should have their own day. It's one of the longer articles I ever wrote, because I basically took 3 and put them together when it was like, I could have, like, taken it easy that week. But bygones will be bygones. So, Enoch Edwards continues in the continent. He joins the Continental Army itself, and he actually becomes an aide-de-camp to General Sterling, Major General William Alexander, aka Lord Sterling, who we talked about many times as the only nobleman, essentially, in the Continental Army. And he served under him as an aide-de-camp, right below him, helping him win battles. And lose some battles, but that's not the point. He later goes on to have a successful career as a judge, and Enoch would go on to serve in the Pennsylvania Ratification Convention. He would serve in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, and would be a member of the convention that wrote the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1790. Now, he lived longer than any of his brothers, though he died at just the age of 50 years old, unfortunately. Now, the youngest brother, Evan Edwards, is probably the most interesting. Evan, like his brother, you guessed it, joined the Pennsylvania militia as the war broke out. He went to, for a brief time, in 1776, all 3 brothers were serving at exactly the same time in the Pennsylvania militia. This didn't last long, like I said. Some dropped, one left for the Continental Army for a bit, one went to private life for a while. They jumped in and out. Evan Edwards ended up joining the staff of General Charles Lee, one of the highest ranking major generals in the Continental Army, a very prestigious position. Unfortunately, Charles Lee said some bad things about George Washington that people caught wind of. Now, if you've seen the play Hamilton, you'll recognize the song 10 Duel Commandments, which features a duel between John Lawrence and Charles Lee. And in the play, Alexander Hamilton was John Lawrence's second in the duel, which is true. Aaron Burr was Charles Lee's second in the duel, which is not true. Now, of course, you got to take some artistic license when you're writing a play. I understand that. You can only hire so many actors to be in the play. But Charles Lee's actual second was right now's founder, Evan Edwards. And he was there when Charles Lee got shot and wounded in the duel, and he was the one who was supposed to get the doctor and afraid that George Washington was coming, though I don't believe George Washington ever showed up to the duel itself. But again, artistic liberties are absolutely fine with me. This relationship was very interesting, his relationship with Lee, because after the war, Charles Lee won some land in South Carolina, where he gave the Lee, if I recall correctly, Charles Lee had already bought land in Virginia, and I believe Lee ended his life in Virginia. I'm not entirely sure where he passed away, but he did win land for his service. South Carolina rewarded him, and some of this property was given to Evan Edwards, who moved south to South Carolina. And he actually participated in the South Carolina General Assembly until he also passed away in 1798 at just 45 years old. So unfortunately, most of these Edward brothers died young, but they did participate in various, what I believe, interesting ways. And again, like I said, one of them kind of didn't do too much, but one had the celebratory dinner for the Declaration of Independence. Another one was the second for Charles Lee. I probably should have made these separate articles, would have saved me some time. But again, this article was from like a year ago, more, maybe 2. Anyway, let's continue. Jonathan Russell. Okay, another article I published a while back, not quite so long ago as the Edwards Brothers article, but Jonathan Russell, a name most people don't know, but an important founder in his own right. So, Jonathan Russell was he was born just before the war broke out, so he's young to be considered a founder, on the edge, and we'll see why. He's kind of like a John Quincy Adams or a Andrew Jackson. Sorry, John Quincy Adams or an Andrew Jackson, as in like, yeah, they were there for the founding, they were around for the war, they were a part of Congress during George Washington's administration, but they really made their name later on. So Russell is iffy as a founder, as those two would be, but I wanted to talk about him because he does have a relationship with John Quincy Adams that is not the best. Anyway, Jonathan Russell ends up becoming a young lawyer, making a name for himself, and he becomes a tax collector at a port in Rhode Island. And he makes enough of a name for himself at this that eventually he is asked by James Madison to go over as minister to France. President James Madison, the minister to France. Jonathan Russell goes to France real quick, and then he's changed over as minister to Britain. And this is an important time because this is just before the War of 1812. Now, Russell is not able to settle these issues, and the War of 1812, in fact, does break out. And Russell goes from being an ambassador to a peace commissioner. And he spends the whole war there in Europe trying to secure peace. And eventually, he does. And he is one of 5 people to sign the Treaty of Ghent. One of these people, John Quincy Adams. Another one of these people is Albert Gallatin, who I've been talking about a whole bunch, who is, at that point was fresh off being Jefferson's and James Madison's Secretary of the Treasury, but I'm not going to get too into that. Also, Henry Clay was signed it, and the gentleman Jonathan Bayard, who I've written about in the past and is very less well known. Either way, Russell signs the Treaty of Ghent and helps end the War of 1812. This is a very important point. And yes, we're closing in on the end of the founding here, but this is just before James Monroe comes in and the era of good feeling begins. And as I've discussed before, for those of you new here, my personal belief is the end of the American Revolution is with James Monroe's presidency and the era of good feelings. Debatable, I know, but that's just my opinion. That's why I'm talking about a gentleman who was peace commissioner in the War of 1812. Either way, Jonathan Russell, after signing the Treaty of Ghent, gets appointed as America's first U.S. ambassador to Sweden, where very little of note happens, but very interesting, first ambassador to Sweden. And I do believe they were in Sweden. They may have been in Sweden when they signed, oh no, the Treaty of Ghent, that's not Sweden, never mind. Either way, over the next 10 years or so, he ends up going to the United States House of Representatives. And while Russell's in the House of Representatives, he kind of conflicts with some other people. One of them is John Quincy Adams, because Russell considered himself a Federalist, even though by the time he's in the House of Representatives, the Federalist Party is already fading away. And he would be there through the era of good feeling, where the Federalist Party all but absolves. Jonathan Russell would continue there, and then eventually you have the fairly famous election of 1824 between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, both of whom were signed the Treaty of Ghent with Jonathan Russell, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. And famously, this goes to the House of Representatives to be discussed, and for whatever reason, Jonathan Russell actually tries to support Henry Clay in this, and he makes the mistake of publishing an article that kind of criticized Adams' behavior, especially during the negotiations of the treaty again, and accuses him of siding too closely with British. Now, this is a very particular attack because John Quincy Adams is, to my understanding, the only American who ever married a British woman. And saying that he was too close with the British, and saying, look, his wife's British, is pretty sound argument to many general people in the public. Granted, I do believe his wife was actually an American, but just grew up in Britain. Again, I don't know a ton about Louisa Adams. I should, and I should write an article on her. Maybe I will. Great. Either way, Jonathan Russell very much underestimated John Quincy Adams's pen, because John Quincy Adams wrote a response that, in the eyes of the American people, completely vindicated himself to the degree that from there on out, to the name Jonathan Russell for several generations in America meant to have yourself proven so wrong publicly that your career ends, because that is basically what happened to Jonathan Russell. So in America, for a long time, you could say that guy got Jonathan Russelled, and everyone would know what you were talking about. Oh, you got so embarrassed your career's over? Yes, you got Jonathan Russell. Now, we are going to move on. We're moving through pretty fast today. I'm a little surprised, considering there were 3 Edward brothers in that one article, but we're going to go on, take a sip of water. Again, people just coming in. I apologize. A little technical difficulty. Can't pull up my images this time, but that's okay. We're going to keep going. Oliver Woolcott Jr. Now, Oliver Woolcott Jr. was the son of Oliver Woolcott Sr., which will not surprise you. What might surprise you is Oliver Woolcott Sr. was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Continental Congressperson, I believe a signer of the Articles of Confederation, though don't quote me on that. He was a major general in the Connecticut militia, and Oliver Woolcott Jr., Sr. just did a whole bunch of stuff. So how would Oliver Woolcott Jr. live up to that? The answer is he would succeed Alexander Hamilton as the second treasurer. Let me say this again. As the second Secretary of the Treasury in the history of the United States. Man, I was going so good that I really messed it up. The drama. He was not the Treasurer of the United States. The Treasurer of the United States is hired by the United States House of Representatives. And the Treasurer of the United States Senate is hired by the United States Senate. I want to be very particular about that. He is not the United States Treasurer. He was the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. Anyway, before this, Oliver Woolcott Jr. grew up in a household where, his daddy was signing the Declaration of Independence. He's a very smart young man. He goes to college with several other important founders whose names are eluding me now in the 1760s. In the 1770s during the war. He graduates and then he ends up working in Connecticut politics for a while. And even though he gets a law degree, he obviously knows finance and excels at finance. And in fact, he becomes part of, and I want to get this right, the Connecticut Committee of Four, which is usually referred to as the pay table. If you hear someone talking about Braden, we're talking about his replacement right now. When you hear someone talk about Connecticut's pay table, they referencing Connecticut's Committee of Four, which handled paying the Connecticut militia. Now, he takes over this position in the early to mid 1780s. I believe it was 1782 he takes over. So the American Revolutionary War should be done, but it's not officially done. But either way, throughout the 1780s and well into American history, each state would have its own militia. And he was responsible for helping to pay this militia. So, Mr. Oliver Woolcott Jr. makes a name as a man of finance. And when the Constitution is approved and the new United States government is being created, well, we need to set up a Treasury Department. And Alexander Hamilton, after Robert Morris, who was George Washington's first choice as Secretary of the Treasury, after Washington defers to Alexander Hamilton helps to appoint the department. So they pick Nicholas. Oliver Woolcott went to submit his name for comptroller. Comptroller was the second highest position after Secretary of the Treasury. Unfortunately, they decided to have Nicholas Eveley become comptroller. I shouldn't say unfortunately. For Nicholas Eveley, that was really sweet. Unfortunately for Oliver Woolcott, they went with Nicholas Eveley because Oliver Woolcott was still young. He was still in his 20s at this point. So the idea was, even though other people were promoting him, the idea was, listen, you kid, you've got time. You will excel. You will move up. So we're going to name you auditor, which is the third highest ranking position in the Treasury Department. So it's not like it's something to snuff at. This is a serious job. Unfortunately, auditor was just kind of watching over things, making sure nothing shady went on, and he did feel like it was below him, though he did seem to have done the job well. And by 1791, Nicholas Eveley dies, and he becomes the first cabinet member in the history of the United States to die while in office. So they kind of default to Oliver Woolcott, though there is a different article I wrote a while back about the debate here, because there was a debate between whose responsibility was it to choose members of the Treasury Department? Was it the Secretary of the Treasury who ran the Treasury Department, or was it Secretary of State who ran the state? And so the question was, did it go to Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton? Now, Hamilton recommends Oliver Woolcott Jr. right away, which many people did. And they do choose Oliver Woolcott to become the second comptroller of the United States. Jefferson made a different recommendation whose name eludes me right now. But what I found interesting is both of them had a secondary recommendation in their letters to George Washington. And they both secondarily recommended Tench Coxe, who I've talked about before here, who was very instrumental. He was at that time acting Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. And you would think they would have chosen him. He was very important in creating Alexander Hamilton's assumption plan. For whatever reason, they didn't, and Washington went with Oliver Woolcott Jr. And this was really good for Oliver Woolcott Jr. because just a few years later, Alexander Hamilton resigns his position to go into private life now that he set up a Treasury Department and banks that would make him filthy rich. And not going to get into that. Now, Oliver Woolcott Jr. is chosen by George Washington to become the second Treasurer of the United States. And in fact, when John Adams succeeds George Washington as president, Adams famously keeps on most of George Washington's cabinet. But halfway through, he gets really angry at like Timothy Pickering and James McHenry for being lackeys for Alexander Hamilton. And Adams fires them. But he keeps Oliver Woolcott around because he did a very good job. Oliver Woolcott would actually resign to private life after his time in the federal government, and he would follow his father into a position he had previously held, which was governor of his home state of Connecticut, where he would sit for 3 years, I believe. He also became a member of the Toleration Party, which another gentleman named Edwards, Pierpont Edwards, unrelated to the Edwards brothers we discussed today, had started the Toleration Party. And this is kind of a side note, but Connecticut, the federal government says, hey, you cannot have a state religion. We have freedom of religion in the United States. But there's nothing that says the states can't have their own state religion. And this was kind of done on purpose because there were states with state religions. And in fact, Connecticut had a state religion at this point. The exact religion eludes me right now. I don't want to say it because I don't want to be wrong and offensive. I did not expect to go off on this particular tangent, but the Toleration Party was started because you had to pay part of your taxes as a tithe to the government to pay for one particular church in Connecticut well into the 1820s. Like, we're talking about well into the history of the United States, 20, 30 years. And the Toleration Party was started to make it so that the government had nothing to do with paying taxes to your church. You could pay your donations directly to your church. And this was done because there were people of other denominations of Christianity who were like, why do I have to pay to that church and pay to my church? Why can't I just pay to my church? And it's interesting Oliver Woolcott took that side in that particular party. So I do see a bunch of comments coming in. I'm going to respond to them real quick as we go through it. Take a quick sip of water. All that trash talk causing duels and drama. Yeah, good thing the internet didn't have back then. Well, now people get to hide anonymously behind the internet. Back then, you called someone a scoundrel, you called it to their face. No, you didn't always call it to their face, but if they found out, yeah, there was some violence going down. Last year, I said, my teacher in 5th grade last year's, said the cabinet, I'll come through. Cabinet was the president's bodyguards. Not really, yeah. Now, what I mean is the 5th grade teacher last year's the cabinet's president's. Coming through. That's okay, man. Braden, that's really funny. Not exactly bodyguards. Kind of like mental bodyguards. They guard his mind. Make sure that everything's clear, making the right decisions. And Troy, yeah, the Toleration Party is super interesting. My pulling things up is a little obscure now. I'm getting the hang of this whole new setup with a real camera and real microphone going live. So I'll get it one day, I promise. I do have an article on my website that makes it easy called Pierpont Edwards and the Toleration Party, but Google the Toleration Party. It's really fascinating how the Toleration Party, again, was like we think like the First Amendment was 2 years into the United States Constitution. That cleared it up. And it's like, no, the states were left to their own devices. Things are much different now in the federal government than they were back then. They still like to pretend it was a federal government and not a national government back in the day, which it most, okay, I mean, and this is my opinion, but it seems to be a national government, not a federal one. That's why the Anti-Federalists were so upset that the Federalists were calling them Anti-Federalists when they were like, no, we are Federalists. We want a confederation. We want a federation of separate states that have their power but work together. And it's like, you want one country that's kind of has separate bodies working within it, was the Anti-Federalist argument. And you can see why they'd be upset about being called anti what they were. It's like if you really liked Coke and you were like, Coca-Cola, I'll specify. If you really liked Pepsi and all your friends called you Anti-Pepsi, you'd be kind of upset about that. And like, that's essentially what they were doing. Wouldn't be calling you pro, you know, I don't know. Anyway, that's a terrible analogy, and we are going to leave it at that. We're going to talk about Isaiah Thomas, not the basketball player. No, of course not. Actually, there were a lot of people I ran into on the internet named Isaiah Thomas doing this research. But we're going to talk about the printer of the Massachusetts Spy. Isaiah Thomas is, he was in Massachusetts, a young man about 21 years old, when he, in 1770, started a newspaper called the Massachusetts Spy. He had worked around New England growing up, learning the trade of this. And I will say, I did reference Isaiah Thomas. Who was I talking about? In a video I made earlier this week that gave me the idea to write about Thomas. Earlier this week, I was talking about, oh, it's going to kill me. 2 days ago, my video, I was talking about a young man who apprenticed for Isaiah Thomas. And anyway, Isaiah Thomas wrote a bunch of stuff in a paper because he learned to do papers. In 1770, he starts the Massachusetts Spy with a friend, but the friend leaves real quick. And he would print the Massachusetts Spy for the next 20 years or so, and then his son would later take over and keep printing it. The Massachusetts Spy was printed in Boston during the years leading up to the American Revolution, and he was arguably the most radical printer in Boston, and they even tried, the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, tried to shut him down on several occasions and just couldn't seem to get it done because he had the support of the people behind him. Interestingly, he also printed several other things, including the Royal American Magazine, and the Royal American Magazine only lasted about a year, but in it, he printed a bunch of engravings by Paul Revere, none other than the Paul Revere. Braden, yes, Anthony Haswell. Thank you so much, Braden. I really appreciate that. Anthony Haswell, very briefly, apprenticed with Isaiah Thomas because Haswell was a poor boy, and the poorhouse said you have to get a job, and they sent him to work there. Later, Haswell would be a famous printer from Vermont and be arrested under the Alien and Sedition Acts. But he learned it during this time while a young man, Thomas, needed help because he was a 20-something-year-old with a new print shop, printing anti-government propaganda in a time where the government would just come down the street like, we know you're doing this. But also, he also printed the Royal American Magazine, which included several engravings by Paul Revere, including the famous one of the Boston Massacre, if I'm not mistaken. This is smoke in the picture. This is what the smoke looks like in my mind. Anyway, getting a little lost on Isaiah Thomas Day, apparently. He, again, was printing super radical information against the government, and then it looks like things are going to go wrong, and there's rumors that the government's going to go out looking for powder from Patriots, and the militiamen are on alert. So Isaiah Thomas takes his printing press and evacuates Boston and goes to Worcester, just outside of Boston. And this is fortuitous because 3 days later, the Battle of Lexington and Concord would break out, which Isaiah Thomas did participate in as an Minuteman. But after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, well, the British are all hauled up in the city of Boston, and the Patriots are outside keeping them, seizing Boston, keeping them in, and he would not have had access to his printing press and had no job. Granted, he probably would have fought more with the army than he did, but that's neither here nor there. He was printing for the Patriots. So he would actually spend the rest of his life in in Worcester. He continued printing. He printed an almanac, the New England Almanac again. Like I said, he printed the Massachusetts Spy forever. He actually kind of followed Ben Franklin's earlier example by franchising out some of his businesses. Although, unlike Franklin, who literally just, here's a franchise, pay me money, Isaiah Thomas seems to be a little bit more hands-on with some of the other operations that were opened around New England. Then one of the interesting, he also interestingly was the first person to get musical type, because remember, when they were printing back then, they would literally have type, and they'd have to put it in the thing, and then dip it in ink, dip it on the paper. So you needed to get, it was called type, and which was like, each individual letter was a different piece of type, you know? So he was the first one to get type of music notes and staffs. So he would actually be able to, was the first American to be able to print music in the United States. He also, speaking of printing, loved printing and spent many decades researching it. And he published a book. Only part one was published during his lifetime. There was a part two that was published like almost 100 years later. But he published a book called History of Printing in America, which was the entire history of printing from the first press to come over to the colonies to the time he was publishing this, which, to be fair, was only like 150 years. I know 150 years is a long time, but each city only got one printer at a time. It wasn't, by the time he was printing, there were a bunch of people, but before he was born, it was a handful at best. Either way, this is a very important historical text that we get to look back when modern historians and students of history are researching the American Revolution, and more specifically colonial America. This is a very important piece for that. Additionally, he collected a lot, not just about printing, but he collected books and all sorts of different pieces because he understood how preserving information was necessary for antiquity. And that's why he started the American Antiquities Society. He called it the American Society of Antiquaries, but it's still around today. It's known as the American Antiquities Society. And when he started it, he was the first president, elected first president, held that position for the remainder of his life, and he donated thousands of his own books and just so many other pieces of correspondence and literature to the start of the American Antiquarian Society. And that society is still really important when it comes to researching history. To this day, they do great work. It's unbiased and very, very important to modern American society. Yeah, Troy, history of printing is tough. there's a lot to it. There's a book. So actually, it's funny you say that, Troy, because this is the American Patriots Handbook. This is my recommendation today, the American Patriots Handbook. I have an affiliate link down below if you're interested, because I couldn't think of what to do. And this is a bunch of great, generally unbiased, although they do end up printing some like Reagan stuff and Bush stuff, which is a little more biased than most of the rest of it, only because it's more modern. But it's a bunch of historical writings from American history that are just super important to the development of the United States. But there's another book you might be interested in that's a little bit thicker. It's called, oh man, I almost chose it as today's book. I should have. Now I really regret it. And it's not behind me. The reason I didn't choose it is it wasn't on the shelf behind me. It's on my bigger bookshelf downstairs. But if you wait around, Troy, at the end of the episode, I'll run down and look if you want. It's not Descent in America. Yeah, I'll find it later if you stick around. Let's go on to our last founder. Although, okay, and Braden, you did ask a question that's impossible to answer. Who was the last founding father? So there's a lot of people. Well, who was the oldest? Those are two different questions. During the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin is the common answer, because by the time the American Revolution breaks out, he's already approaching 70 by the time the Declaration of Independence is written. And when he's there for the Constitutional Convention, he was born in 1607 or 9. But either way, before 1710, and we're talking about 1780s, so that's 70, he's like approaching 80 years old by the time they write the Constitution, which essentially makes him the oldest founder. It's as far as the big names go, it's going to be Ben Franklin. I mean, meanwhile, he's like 40 years older than Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. He's 30 years older than George Washington. They all grew up reading Poor Richard Almanac. Like, Ben Franklin was a celebrity to the other founders while they were children. That being said, you're reading for an Aaron book. Oh, you ordered the Burr book. Yeah, nice. Oh, man. There's a good book. You got good taste. You're going to like them. You're going to like them a lot. But yeah, no, Ben Franklin pretty much was the old man. Roger Sherman was a little bit older than most, and he signed most of the major documents. We also have all the Livingston brothers, Philip Livingston, William Livingston. Most of the Livingston brothers were a little bit older, considering it was a fairly young man's revolution. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence at 32 years old. Like, it's still, like, now that I'm older than 30, it surprised me when I was younger than 32, but now that I'm well older than 32, it makes me feel lazy. But yeah, so Yeah, I'd have to go with Benjamin Franklin. Now, if you want to ask who lived the longest, you're looking at James Madison lived till like 1836. The oldest signer of the Declaration to live the longest was Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Um, and then there's arguments to be made, like we've had the discussion about Andrew Jackson. Does he count as a founder? He was 13 years old and had a British soldier slash his face with a sword during the American Revolutionary War. Does that make him a founder? He was part of the House of Representatives during George Washington's administration. Does that make him a founder? He lived longer than anyone we've discussed, though I would argue he's not, because there's the age of Jackson is after the American founding, and it's literally named after him. But let's go. You thought I was 25? Aw, thanks, man. That's nice. I am not. I am approaching 37. And while that feels young, tell that to my back. So we're going to head on to our last founder. I'll be happy to chit-chat a little bit after we do this, because this one's pretty short. Gentleman Robert Gibbs Barnwell. And Gibbs Barnwell had a very interesting life. He was 16 years old and not really well educated, and he joined the South Carolina militia as a private. And please note that I do always do my best to distinguish between the Continental Army and the state militia. They were separate bodies that were organized separately and had separate tiers of officers and responded technically to separate congresses. Though during the Revolution, there was an agreement that George Washington, as head of the Continental Army, was in charge. So if Washington ordered you to do something, you would do it, generally speaking. Unless you were someone like John Stark, who had left the Continental Army because he was very angry at what was going on and refused to take orders from the Continental Army. Though, if he did receive an order directly from George Washington, I'm willing to wager Stark would have done it because he did very much care for George Washington. Either way, Robert Gibbs Barnwell is a nobody, and he joins the South Carolina militia as a private at 16 years old. By the time he turns 18, there was a raid at the Battle of Matthews Plantation in South Carolina, which is not a battle I had heard of before, and Julie didn't put a ton of research into because I was writing about this gentleman instead. Sorry. But what it seems to have been, the Battle of Matthews Plantation, seems to have been more of the Americans were camping and possibly even sleeping when the British did a nighttime raid and came in and started slashing. And Robert Gibbs Barnwell, as an 18-year-old, was cut at least a dozen, up to, I read, 17 times with bayonets. I also understand that he was left for dead and that his valuables were taken from him. Now, I could not determine if the valuables were taken from other militiamen on his side or the British on the other side. Probably the British on the other side, because his teammates would have tried to revive him back to health, as opposed to the British, who would have taken him as prisoner. But why would you take an 18-year-old who's going to slow you down and isn't going to be worth trading like an officer might be in an exchange? So he's left for dead. Now he's found by a local slave who recognizes him, figures out he's alive still, and takes him to his family, and his aunt nurses him back to health for the better part of a year. So now he's not yet 20 years old, and he's fine. Well, he's better after a year of recovery. And what does he do? He goes back to the South Carolina militia, and he gets there just in time to join the siege of Charleston, and he is arrested with the rest of the Continentals when Benjamin Lincoln surrenders Charleston, and he's put right on a prison ship and spends more than a year on a prison ship named the Pack Horse in pretty terrible conditions, and somehow survives that also. So at this point, he's about 21, maybe 22 years old. He's been wounded 17 times and spent a year in deplorable conditions on a prison ship. And what does he do? He goes right back to the militia. Now, he does not stay with the militia long because the war ends, thankfully, for this young man. Now, this young man with essentially no education somehow ends up becoming a politician. And probably, I would have presumed, on the back of, hey, look at all these wounds I got. Vote for me. And he's elected to the South Carolina Assembly. And in turn, he's actually sent to the Continental Congress. And why is it the Continental Congress? He is there for the final 2 years, 1787 through 1789. So he's there for the creation of the Constitution. He's there when they approve the Constitution. He's one of the people who approves the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And he's there in the final days leading up to the closure of the Continental Congress, which, of course, was called either the Continental Association or the Congress of the Confederation. No, I'm sorry, the Confederation Congress or the Congress of the Confederation after the Articles of Confederation. That's why I always call it the Continental Congress, because that's what they called it. They always called it the Continental Congress. We as historians have come up with several names for it since, and that's a bad idea because we're all over the place. So either way, he is one of their men there for the close of the the Continental Congress and the opening of the United States Congress, though he is not elected to that body. So he goes from New York all the way back down to South Carolina, and he goes back to the state assembly, and then he actually becomes Speaker of the House for a few years. As, like I said, an uneducated kid who essentially ran on a, like, I was wounded in the war platform, makes his way up to Speaker. He seems to be moderate enough where people care for him and trusted enough where he has that kind of power. And then what do? Then they send him back to New York to join the United States House of Representatives for its second session. He's not an inaugural member, but he is in its second session. Not a lot to speak of during his time there. But then he returns home to South Carolina, and he spends a few years in South Carolina's state senate. And interestingly enough, and unfortunately I ran out of time, I couldn't figure out why, but he was a year and a half he spent in the state senate. In the last 2 weeks, at the end of his term, he was elected as president of the South Carolina State Senate. I can only imagine that the person who was sitting president either passed away or went home. But again, that's an assumption on my part. For I don't know why he spent just 2 weeks as president of the South Carolina Senate, but he did. And it's quite a career he built for him, essentially on the back of severe suffering during the American Revolutionary War. A real American hero, if there ever was one. So that wraps up this week. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulty. I switched stuff. Yeah, he was a young man who was all about war. I can only presume that his war wounds is so early at such a young age made him lust for revenge. Which is why I would presume he went right back, only to be sent to a prison ship. He did kill someone in a duel. Robert Gibbs Barnwell? Did you look that up, Braden? Or are we talking about another man? Because I feel like I would have ran into that in my research, though not necessarily. I often don't see everything. Again, like, generally my articles are, I'll write one over the weekends, 2 or 3 a day, and I do the research and then I write them real quick, so they take me 1 to 3 hours each. There are definitely things I could overlook, especially with a guy like this, where I kind of got my story early. It's like, okay, he was seriously injured and put in precarious situations through the war. When he did, no, we're talking about a gentleman named Robert Gibbs Barnwell. I did mention Andrew Jackson before in passing. When we're talking about the older American revolutionaries. Seeing if there's any questions. Now, that's essentially all I got today. If you guys do want to ask more questions, by all means. I do want to run downstairs and grab and check out that book for you. I know you already got a lot of rabbit holes, Troy, but it's about printing. It's not about the American Revolution. It's printing, something about freedom of the press. Oh, it's going to bother me. Yeah, you know what? I'll say this because I'm sure you guys will leave. I'm going to run down and grab that book. I am going to grab the book. I'm going to put you on a brief hold. I don't have hold music. I need to get it. Again, I'm still figuring out how to go live. I'm a history nerd, not a computer student. It's all new to me. I finally learned how to get the color right. I look decent. And I learned for trivia on Friday that I'm going to slow down the latency, which means my image won't be so good, but my it'll be almost immediate, my response to whatever you say. I'm also going to try out a few new things at trivia this week that I think you guys like. Post on Friday. All right, I'll bring you to trivia on Friday. Excellent. Thank you, Troy. I don't want to leave everyone hanging. But yeah, no, trivia I think is going to be fun. It's officially going to be sponsored. Okay, I'll start it this week. I spoke with Tyson, who runs Liberty & Co., who is the company I'm always talking about, I've been giving away the magnets from Liberty & Co. at Trivia Night, despite not really having approval. I talked to Tyson over there, who is officially going to start sponsoring Liberty & Co. Apparently, he just sent me a box of giveaways for Trivia Night today. So thank you to Tyson. Look forward to that. I now can officially be telling you guys how much I love his products, because I do. I mean, yeah, I'm literally wearing one of his Washington shirt right now. I shouldn't do this on camera. Let's look for it, but like this is the Liberty & Co. Washington's shirt. Yeah, awesome sponsor news is right, Troy. Liberty & Co.'s Washington headquarters shirt. I've had this for 2.5 years. I wash it, just throw it in the wash and pull it out. It's super comfortable. It looks great. I'm like a fan of his products. So yeah, check it out. I don't have a link in the description down below. I will on Friday when he's sponsoring. And yeah, again, right now it's just the trivia thing, but we've been talking. High hopes for the future with Liberty & Co. Again, I'm pumped because they're by far my favorite purveyor of American Revolution items. His designs are unique, but beautiful, and you're not going to find them anywhere else. You know, you can go anywhere and find like the "Don't Tread on Me" snake, or you know, several other things. But I mean, I even got a cup in the background. There's stuff in it. I'm not going to be picking everything off the shelf, but like, I'm pumped, and you should be too. So I'm not sure what we're giving away this week for the winner, but we are going to do things. I think, let me know what you think about this. I might be doing first come, first serve. Like when you answer the question, whoever answers the question correctly first wins, because I am coming up with questions of my own, just like Ned recommended. So that is it. I will remember to bring the book next week. Braden, the Aaron Burr book is called Burr by Nancy Eisenberg. Oh, here it is. No, it's called Fallen Founder by Nancy Eisenberg. This is a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. I have a link below to this book, but if you click on that, you support the site. If you buy through the affiliate links, I get like 30 cents of Amazon's money. Even if you click on it and buy a different book. Oh, you guys just watched me scare the life out of myself. Looks like my coffee cup is smashed together, but everything's okay. Just a little scared. I just thought the roof was caving in. It's no big deal. I'm going to watch on the side to see. Yep, there it is. Okay. I'm a little ahead of you guys. Like I said, going to change that with the latency I learned about for Friday. So, again, you guys have any other questions? I'm always happy to take it. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and you can message me there. If you want to email me, I have a new email address, which finally just went through today. I did a bunch of internal changes. I changed my domain name to another hosting service, which meant I had to change my email address, which I just realized I have to go on the website and change. It's no longer contact at Founder of the Day. It is now Jason at Founder of the Day, because we're going to put a face to the name. Isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? So if you did try and email me at all this week, it did not go through. Not that I'm expecting a ton of emails, though you can subscribe to my email list. I don't know if I have the link below for that, but anyway, check out the website. I'm kind of rambling here because you guys are all still hanging out. I don't want to flat leave anyone. That's not cool. But like again, you're welcome. You're welcome, Braden. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Again, I'm always open to questions, any recommendations for founders. I still have a few that you guys have recommended that I have not quite gotten to yet. They are a-coming. Mark my words. And that's that, I guess. I'm not sure where else to go from here. Thank you so much. I'm going to go. I do want to go write some more articles. Yeah, thank you, Troy. Thank you guys for coming. Everyone who's here, I can't appreciate you more. I am going to head out now. I will be back, like I said, a new regular video tomorrow. I'm hoping, as long as I got everything set, to do some interviews, at least one this weekend, and bring the interviews back next week. We're crossing our fingers that we can get that done. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. New videos every day of the week. Founder of the Day, and there's trivia on Friday. I will see you at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time this coming Friday, and round bottom.